Let's go to our next guest in the program, James Campbell, joining us for his, well, weekly thoughts, I guess. Now, James is investigations editor for the Herald Sun. We better talk about this Clare O'Neil speech, James. I'll just start off unvarnished. What are your thoughts on the direction she suggests the Labor Party should go, the latest person to provide some free advice?
Well, I'll be honest. I picked up the paper this morning and Clare was smiling out at me from the front page of the Australian, telling the Labor Party that they ought not to look down on people. And I have to say, I kind of thought, oh, that's an interesting perspective from Clare, because let's be frank, her reputation among her colleagues is not she doesn't have the reputation as being one of the warmest members of the caucus. At any rate, so I picked up the speech thinking, oh, they're going to have a good chuckle at this. And I have to say, I was super duper surprised. It is a very sensible, very coherent, and I would say a rather clever speech, in which she talks about a lot of the problems that are facing our society and economy in Australia in 2019. It's actually a speech of quite extraordinary generosity of spirit too. Something else I have to say I was a little bit surprised about. I would recommend anybody read it, and she's even got a kind word for the media in the section in which she discusses the rise of social media and the capacity which everybody now has to have their say. And she says, the fact that once upon a time ideas were filtered by journalists may have had some merit to it, which a sentiment I can only wholly endorse from Clare there.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, and some of her colleagues have pointed out that, you know, this doesn't necessarily go in keeping with a book she wrote in 2015. But look, we all go on journeys, so I do want to focus on the substance as well with you. I found it really interesting when she delved into this aspect of when people are pilloried in debates, and she mentioned anti-vaxxers, which, you know, are the butt of a lot of cartoons and jokes. And she said, you know, a lot of people start off with concern over their child, fair enough, and, you know, there have been issues in the past with what medicine has done with people, that these things do happen, and 4 or 5 hours later they can turn into anti-vaxxers, and that's the issue. If you're going to bring these people back from the brink, it's not by mercilessly mocking them necessarily.
Absolutely. The ease with which people can become radicalised with, you know, 4 or 5 hours on Google is one of the troubles of our age. Really, what this speech is about, if you read it in toto, is it's a discussion of the difficulties that anybody in politics is going to have going forward, creating a consensus and a majority. That the opinions in society are fracturing, they're becoming more radicalised at the extremes. She talks about a Venn diagram, you know, society is essentially a Venn diagram in which the areas in which all the different circles in the Venn diagram intersect are becoming smaller and smaller. She's also bang on, I think, when she says that these days, the old James Carville line about the economy stupid just doesn't really cut it anymore. The divisions that are driving so much in politics now are to do with social issues. Whereas once upon a time, social issues were things that political parties like to get out of the way quickly so they could get back onto the main game of economics. Now there are people in politics who, their whole career in politics is really revving up things. These sorts of cleavages inside parties have become bigger and more important than we've ever seen before. And O'Neill's point is that... Go on.
No. Well, I was just going to say, and I agree with that. I think reading this myself, I was struck by the number of people I could think of in my head turned off by debates as soon as someone is labelled a bigot or a racist, as soon as they've sort of, and not to excuse people that are, but as soon as someone, you know, steps into any sort of territory uncomfortable with progressive change, that a label gets slapped on there. And even casting my mind back to same-sex marriage, I remember, you know, my own late grandmother who was very uncomfortable with it initially and eventually said, no, well, you know, this makes sense to me. I know gay people, they should be able to get married too, but it was a journey.
That's right. But the problem for social democratic parties is, and she's right about this, is if they shout at people about this stuff and they shout them down, the net result is they don't vote Labor or they don't vote Democrat. They, in the privacy of their the ballot box vote for Donald Trump. And this is and this is a problem, and particularly, I would argue, middle-aged men who feel that economics and the world is sort of, not only of economics, but the culture as well is kind of turned against them. They look at Trump, and if they were comfortable and happy in their lives, they'd probably think, you know, this guy has, what is this guy offering me? But the point about Trump, and one of his great appeals is he belts the people that they hate. You know, mine enemy's enemy is my friend. And in a sense, that's what O'Neil is kind of putting her finger on this. Now, lots of people are putting their finger on this at the time. The problem we have at the moment is we're not short of diagnoses about what's wrong, what's going wrong. We can all see what's going wrong with the patient. The problem we've got is nobody has yet really come up with something that looks like a cure.
Yeah. Well, look, that's true, and I guess for now, Labor's more about the diagnosis, and perhaps that's fair enough. I guess when we're talking as well about, you know, this reality check at the ballot box, and one that, you know, I wasn't sitting out there saying was going to happen before the election, it's a difference between what someone might say when they're asked in the street, in public about something, a vox pop if you like, or a morning coffee with 5 people sitting around the table, versus what they'll say to a friend 3 or 4 drinks in.
Absolutely. People kept saying, you know, I don't like Bill Shorten, I don't like Bill Shorten. And we didn't listen to that. Because the polls were saying, oh no, it's going to be all right. But, you know, everybody picked up there was an antipathy to him, rightly or wrongly. And, you know, in the end, that held out. I mean, that came to pass. The thing that's also interesting to me, though, is, I mean, this kind of Labor navel-gazing that's going on at the moment, right? It's interesting. It kind of divides between those who sort of think, well, at the end of the day, the government's got a 2-seat majority and we came pretty close, and, you know, maybe with a bit of a tweak and some hair gel and a brighter, shinier presentation and a few less stupid policies, we might get there. And those who are saying, well, actually, we've got a large long-term problem, and I would put O'Neil in the second camp, because at one point in this speech, she talks about the steady declining primary vote of the ALP, which she says, you know, but pretty much on average it drops 1% every single federal election. And unless they can find a way of, in the long term, turning that around, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to win elections. And more importantly, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to stay in office, even if they do fluke one election in 5.
That's a really good point, and she mounted that stat from the mid-70s. So, you know, the time that they rised up with Gough Whitlam, averaging out there 1% each election on a primary. So when you put it like that, it's, you know, the trend is not the friend. James Campbell, really enjoyed your thoughts today. Thank you. Chat next week.
It's good to see you again, Tom.